Something happened on a quiet Tuesday morning that nobody in the galaxy was ready for. The sky turned dark. Not from clouds, not from storms, from ships. Hundreds of them, falling, fast. And inside those ships were not robots, not missiles, not weapons of mass destruction. Inside those ships were humans, regular humans, with beating hearts, with fear in their eyes, with something burning in their chests that no alien species had ever seen before, the will to survive no matter what. The alien commanders had run every calculation, every simulation, every war game. They had studied humanity for decades. They had watched human wars, human failures, human weakness, and they had decided humans were not a threat. They were wrong. What happened next was not just a battle. It was not just a war. It was the moment the entire galaxy learned one terrifying truth. You never, ever underestimate a human soldier. In this story, you are going to discover 3 things that will completely change how you see humanity. First, you will learn why every alien empire in the known galaxy had already written humans off as weak, slow, and easy to defeat. Second, you will discover what happened in the first 60 seconds after those human soldiers hit the ground. 60 seconds that changed everything. Third, and this is the part nobody talks about, you will find out what the alien commanders said to each other after the battle was over. What they admitted in secret. What they were too proud to say out loud. This is not just a story about war. This is a story about what humans are made of. What we carry inside us that no other species can explain. No other species can copy. And no other species can stop. Let me show you exactly how this happened. The Velthari Empire had existed for 6,000 years. 6,000 years of war, 6,000 years of conquest, 6,000 years of building the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever seen. They had defeated 47 civilizations. Some of those civilizations had been older than humanity itself. Some had been smarter. Some had been stronger. Some had technology so advanced that even the Velthari scientists could not fully understand it. But the Velthari had defeated them all. Not because they were the biggest. Not because they were the fastest. Not because they had the best weapons. The Velthari won because they were patient. They studied their enemies. They learned every weakness, every fear, every mistake. And then they struck at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right force. They were the most calculated military power in the known galaxy. And they had been watching Earth for a long time. The first Velthari scout ship had entered the outer edge of the solar system almost 200 years before the events of this story. It had been a small ship, unmanned, loaded with sensors and cameras and listening devices so advanced that they could pick up a single human heartbeat from orbit. The ship had spent 40 years circling the solar system, recording everything, sending data back to the Velthari homeworld in tight compressed bursts that no human technology could detect. The Velthari analysts had spent decades going through that data, and their conclusion had been unanimous. Humans were not a threat. The report that came back from the analysis team was almost insulting in how dismissive it was. It described humans as a young species, emotionally unstable, prone to conflict with each other, technologically primitive compared to most spacefaring civilizations, physically weak by galactic standards, average lifespan too short to develop the kind of long-term strategic thinking that made a species truly dangerous. The report noted that humans did have one unusual trait. They called it persistence. Humans had a strange tendency to keep going even when logic said they should stop. Even when the odds were impossible. Even when every rational calculation said surrender was the only option. The analysts had flagged this as a curiosity. An interesting quirk. Nothing more. They did not flag it as a danger. That was their first mistake. The Velthari had moved on from Earth quickly. There were bigger targets. More valuable planets. More advanced civilizations with technology worth taking. Earth was a small, wet rock on the edge of a minor spiral arm. It had some useful minerals, some interesting biological diversity, but nothing that made it a priority, so they left it alone. For a while. The second time the Velthari turned their attention to Earth, things had changed. Humanity had changed. In the 200 years since that first scout ship, humans had done something that genuinely surprised the Velthari analysts. They had not destroyed themselves. Every probability model had suggested that humanity would collapse under the weight of its own internal conflicts, wars, climate disasters, political failures. The models had given humanity less than a 30% chance of surviving the next 2 centuries without a civilization-ending catastrophe. But humans had survived. More than survived. They had grown. They had spread. Small colonies on the moon, a permanent base on Mars, mining operations in the asteroid belt, early experimental faster-than-light research that was still primitive but pointed in the right direction. Humanity was not yet a spacefaring civilization in the full sense. But it was getting there. The Velthari updated their assessment. Humans were still not a threat. But they were becoming an inconvenience. If left alone for another century or two, they might develop technology that would make them harder to deal with. The Velthari High Command made a decision. Earth would be pacified, not destroyed. The planet was too valuable for that. But the human civilization would be brought under Velthari control before it became a problem. It was supposed to be simple. The Velthari sent a fleet. Not their biggest fleet. Not their best commanders. This was not considered a serious military operation. It was considered a cleanup job. The kind of mission they gave to mid-level commanders who needed experience. The fleet that approached Earth was powerful enough to destroy every human military asset in the solar system 3 times over. The Velthari commander in charge of the operation was a decorated officer named Veth-Karen. He had pacified 11 civilizations in his career. He was good at his job, efficient, professional, completely confident. He had read the reports on humanity. He had studied the data. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. Or so he thought. What Veth-Karen did not know, what none of the Velthari analysts had fully understood, was that humanity had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Not because they knew the Velthari were coming. They did not. But because humans had always known, somewhere deep in their collective instinct, that the universe was not empty. And that whatever was out there might not be friendly. The human military had changed in those 200 years. Quietly. Steadily. Without fanfare. The public knew about the space colonies. The public knew about the Mars base. But what the public did not fully know, what was classified at the highest levels of every major government on Earth, was the program that had been running in secret for almost a century. They called it the Skyfall Initiative. It had started as a theoretical project. A small team of military strategists and scientists asking a simple question. If humanity ever faced a threat from space, how would we fight back? The early work was almost philosophical. Thought experiments, war games played out on paper, scenarios that most people would have called science fiction. But over the decades, the Skyfall Initiative had grown. It had attracted funding. It had attracted the best military minds on the planet. It had attracted soldiers. Real soldiers. Men and women who had volunteered for something they were told might never be needed. Something they were told was a precaution. A last resort. They had trained for 30 years. Not in normal military bases. In facilities buried deep underground. In orbital stations that did not appear on any public map. In environments designed to simulate every possible combat scenario that the strategists could imagine. Zero-gravity combat. Atmospheric entry under fire. Fighting in environments with no oxygen. Fighting against enemies that were bigger, faster, and stronger than any human opponent. They had trained for the impossible. And when the Velthari fleet appeared at the edge of the solar system, the Skyfall Initiative was ready. Veth-Karen sent his standard opening message. The same message he had sent to 11 other civilizations. Surrender. Submit to Velthari authority. Resistance is futile. The message was transmitted on every frequency. It was impossible to miss. The human response came back in less than 10 minutes. It was not a surrender. It was not a negotiation. It was a single line of text, transmitted in the Velthari language. because the Skyfall Initiative had been studying Velthari communications for decades. The message said, "We have been waiting for you." Veth Karen read that message 3 times. He felt something he had not felt in a long time. Something unfamiliar. Something that his species did not have a precise word for. Later, a human linguist would have called it unease. He ordered the fleet to advance. And somewhere deep in the asteroid belt, in a facility that did not officially exist, a general named Sarah Chen looked at her screen, watched the Velthari fleet begin to move, and said 4 words to the soldiers standing behind her. "It is time, people." Nobody outside the program knew their names. That was intentional. The soldiers of the Skyfall Initiative had given up a lot when they signed on. They had given up their public identities, their social media, their ability to tell family members what they actually did for a living. They had given up the normal life that most people took for granted. What they got in return was something harder to explain. They got purpose. Not the vague, general kind of purpose that people talk about at motivational seminars. Real purpose. The kind that gets into your bones. The kind that makes you wake up every morning knowing exactly why you are here and exactly what you are training for. The soldiers of the Skyfall Initiative knew that they might be the last line of defense between humanity and extinction. They carried that knowledge every single day, and it made them extraordinary. General Sarah Chen had been with the program for 22 years. She had joined as a young combat pilot, fresh out of the most elite military academy in North America. She had been recruited personally by the program's founder, a retired general named Marcus Webb, who had spent his entire career convinced that first contact with alien life would not be peaceful. Webb had been right. He had died 8 years before the Velthari arrived, but his program had survived him. His soldiers had survived him. Sarah Chen was his greatest achievement. She stood in the command center of Facility Omega, a hollowed-out asteroid roughly the size of a small city, positioned in the outer asteroid belt, and she watched the Velthari fleet on her screens with the calm focus of someone who had been preparing for this exact moment for more than 2 decades. The fleet was large. She had expected that. The Velthari were not stupid. They would not send a small force to pacify a planet. But the size of the fleet also told her something important. It told her that the Velthari did not consider this a serious fight. A truly serious Velthari military operation would have been 3 times larger. This was a pacification fleet, a cleanup crew. They thought this was going to be easy. Sarah allowed herself one small smile. Then she turned to her command team and began issuing orders. The Skyfall Initiative had 3 main components. The first was the Orbital Defense Network, a series of weapons platforms and sensor arrays positioned throughout the solar system, most of them disguised as natural objects or inactive debris. The Velthari scanners had passed over them dozens of times without identifying them as threats. That was by design. The second component was the ground forces, 12,000 soldiers, the best humanity had ever produced, stationed in hidden facilities on Earth, the Moon, and Mars. These were not ordinary soldiers. They had been trained in every form of combat imaginable. They were physically enhanced through decades of research into human performance. They wore armor that had taken 50 years to develop, lighter than anything the Velthari had seen from human technology, but built with materials and engineering principles that the Velthari analysts had never thought to look for. The third component was the one that gave the program its name, the drop pods. The Skyfall Initiative had been built around a single tactical concept. In a conflict with a technologically superior enemy, conventional military strategy would fail. You could not fight a Velthari fleet ship to ship. You could not win a conventional space battle against an enemy with 6,000 years of military development. Trying to fight that way would be suicide. But there was one thing that the Velthari, and almost every other spacefaring civilization, had never fully prepared for. Soldiers falling from the sky. Not missiles, not bombs, not automated weapons. Human soldiers. In drop pods designed to survive atmospheric entry, orbital bombardment, and direct weapons fire. Pods that could be launched from hidden positions throughout the solar system and reach a target, any target, including enemy ships, in minutes. Pods that were nearly impossible to track on standard Velthari sensors because they were built to mimic the thermal and electromagnetic signature of natural space debris. The concept was insane. Everyone who had first heard it had said so, dropping human soldiers directly onto enemy ships, directly into enemy formations, directly into the middle of a battle that was already happening. The casualty projections had been horrifying. The early simulations had been brutal. But the soldiers had volunteered anyway, every single one of them, because they understood something that the casualty projections did not capture. They understood that the element of surprise, real surprise, the kind that breaks an enemy's ability to think clearly, was worth more than any weapon. And nothing in the Velthari's 6,000 years of military experience had prepared them for the sight of human soldiers falling out of the sky directly onto their ships. The Velthari fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter and began its approach to Earth. Veth-Karen was running standard approach protocols, sensors sweeping, shields at moderate power, weapons hot but not at full charge. He was not expecting resistance. He was expecting the same thing he had seen 11 times before. Panic. Desperate last-minute communications. Offers to negotiate. Maybe a few primitive weapons fired in a futile gesture of defiance before the inevitable surrender. What his sensors showed him instead was nothing. No military response. No weapons fire. No communications except civilian broadcasts that showed a human population that appeared to be going about its normal day. No sign that the humans had even noticed the fleet. That bothered him. He had expected panic. Panic was normal. Panic was predictable. Panic told you that the enemy had seen you and was afraid. The absence of panic meant one of two things. Either the humans had not detected the fleet, which seemed impossible given that they had clearly been developing their sensor technology, or the humans had detected the fleet and were not afraid. He did not like either option. He ordered his science officer to run a deep scan of the solar system. Full spectrum. Every frequency. He wanted to know where the human military was. He wanted to know what they were doing. He wanted to understand why they were so quiet. The scan took 4 minutes. When the results came back, Veth-Karen stared at his screen for a long moment. Then he called his senior officers to the bridge. The scan had found the human military. It had found it everywhere. Hidden in the asteroid belt, hidden on the dark side of the moon. Hidden in orbital positions that should have been empty. Hidden in places that the Velthari analysts had marked as uninhabited, unimportant, irrelevant. 12,000 soldiers. 12,000 drop pods. Positioned throughout the solar system in a pattern that Veth-Karen recognized immediately. It was a trap. He opened his mouth to order a retreat. He was too late. The first drop pods had already launched. They fell in silence. That was the first thing every Skyfall soldier remembered about it afterward. The silence. Inside the drop pod, with the walls sealed and the engines cut to minimize the thermal signature, there was almost no sound. Just the faint vibration of the pod moving through space. Just the sound of your own breathing. Just the sound of your own heartbeat. Loud in your ears, counting down the seconds. Each pod carried one soldier. 12,000 pods. 12,000 soldiers. Launched in a coordinated sequence that had been planned and rehearsed for years. The timing was precise to the millisecond. The targeting was precise to the meter. Every pod had a specific target. Every soldier knew exactly where they were going, and exactly what they were supposed to do when they got there. Corporal James Reeves was 26 years old. He was from a small town in rural Ohio. He had joined the regular military at 18, been recruited into the Skyfall Initiative at 21, and had spent the last 5 years training for this exact moment. He was not the biggest soldier in the program. He was not the fastest. He was not the most decorated. But he was, by every measure his commanders had, the most stubborn. James Reeves did not quit. It was not in him. His instructors had tried everything to break him in training. Sleep deprivation. Physical exhaustion pushed far beyond normal human limits. Psychological pressure designed to make soldiers doubt themselves, doubt the mission, doubt everything. James Reeves had gone through all of it with the same quiet, steady determination. He did not complain. He did not break. He just kept going. His target was a Velthari destroyer, mid-sized ship, part of the outer screen of the fleet. His pod was programmed to hit the ship's secondary weapons bay, a section of the hull that the Skyfall analysts had identified as structurally weaker than the rest of the ship, and critically important to the destroyer's combat effectiveness. He had 47 seconds until impact. He used those 47 seconds the way he always used waiting time. He breathed, slow and steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth. He checked his equipment one more time, not because he thought anything would be wrong. He had checked it 6 times already, but because the routine of checking calmed his mind. He thought about his training. He thought about his team. He thought about the mission. He did not think about dying. Not because he was not afraid. He was afraid. Every soldier in every pod was afraid. Fear was normal. Fear was human. Fear was the thing that sharpened your senses, and made you faster, and made you fight harder. The Skyfall Initiative had not tried to train the fear out of its soldiers. It had trained them to use it. 20 seconds. On the bridge of the Velthari destroyer, alarms were going off. The sensors had finally picked up the incoming pods, not as weapons, not as missiles, but as debris. Hundreds of pieces of debris, all moving on converging trajectories toward the fleet. The weapons officer was trying to classify the threat. The captain was demanding answers. Nobody had answers yet. 10 seconds. James Reeves closed his eyes. 5 seconds. He opened them. The pod hit the hull of the Velthari destroyer like a hammer hitting glass. The impact was controlled. The pod's nose was designed to punch through standard Velthari hull plating and anchor itself in place before the soldier inside was exposed to the ship's interior. The process took less than 2 seconds. 2 seconds of violent, disorienting impact. 2 seconds of noise so loud it felt physical. 2 seconds of the world turning into chaos. Then, the pod door blew open, and James Reeves stepped out into the corridor of a Velthari warship. The corridor was wide, wider than human corridors. The Velthari were larger than humans, about 7 feet tall on average, with 4 arms and a physiology built for strength and endurance. The corridor was lit in the deep blue-green light that Velthari ships used, a frequency that was comfortable for their eyes but slightly disorienting for human vision. James had trained in simulated Velthari lighting for 3 years. His eyes adjusted in seconds. There were 2 Velthari soldiers in the corridor. They were staring at him. In their 6,000 years of military history, the Velthari had never had an enemy soldier appear inside one of their ships from a hole in the hull. It was not something they had trained for. It was not something they had a protocol for. For approximately 1 full second, the 2 Velthari soldiers simply stared at the human who had just fallen out of the wall. James Reeves did not waste that second. He moved. What happened in the next 3 minutes in that corridor was not something that can be fully described in words. It was fast. It was brutal. It was the product of 5 years of the most intense close-quarters combat training ever developed by human military science. James Reeves was smaller than both Velthari soldiers. He was slower in terms of raw speed. He was weaker in terms of raw strength. But he was unpredictable. That was the thing the Velthari had never accounted for. Human combat style was chaotic in a way that their training had not prepared them for. Velthari military combat was precise, disciplined, based on established forms and techniques that had been refined over centuries. It was effective against every enemy they had ever faced. It was not effective against a human who had been trained to fight dirty. James secured the corridor in 3 minutes. He moved to the secondary weapons bay. He planted the charges he had carried in his pack. He sent the confirmation signal to General Chen's command center. Then he moved deeper into the ship, because his mission was not finished yet. All around the fleet, the same scene was playing out 12,000 times. 12,000 pods. 12,000 soldiers. 12,000 holes punched in the hulls of Velthari warships. 12,000 humans stepping out into corridors and weapons bays and engine rooms and command centers, moving with the terrifying efficiency of people who had been training for this moment for years. The Velthari fleet had been designed to fight other ships, It had shields against energy weapons, armor against missiles, point defense systems against incoming projectiles. It had every defense that 6,000 years of military development could provide against the threats that 6,000 years of military experience had taught them to expect. It had no defense against this. Vethkaren stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his fleet fall apart in real time. Ship after ship going dark. Ship after ship reporting internal breaches. Ship after ship going silent. His communications were flooded with reports that made no sense. Soldiers inside the ships. Human soldiers. Everywhere. Moving through his fleet like they owned it. He had one thought. Clear and cold and completely unlike anything he had felt in 40 years of military service. He was afraid. The Velthari had a word for what was happening to their fleet. The word translated roughly as the unraveling. It was an old word. Ancient. It came from Velthari mythology. A story about a great empire that had been destroyed not by an outside enemy, but by a weakness that had been growing inside it for years, invisible and ignored, until one day it simply came apart. Vethkaren had studied that story as a young officer. His instructors had used it as a lesson about the importance of internal security, about the danger of complacency, about what happened when you stopped taking threats seriously. He had never imagined he would live it. The battle inside the ships was unlike anything in Velthari military history. It was not a battle in any conventional sense. There were no front lines. There were no clear positions. There was no way to coordinate a defense, because the enemy was already inside, already moving, already hitting targets before the defenders could organize a response. The human soldiers moved in small teams, 2 or 3 soldiers per ship, in most cases, sometimes just one. They did not try to hold territory. They did not try to capture the ships. They had specific targets, weapon systems, engine rooms, communications arrays, command centers, and they moved toward those targets with single-minded focus, neutralizing anyone who got in their way. Lieutenant Commander Yara Osei was one of the senior Skyfall officers aboard the Velthari flagship. She had entered the ship through the engine section, along with 2 other soldiers, Sergeant Marcus Webb Jr., the son of the program's founder, and Specialist Aiko Tanaka, the youngest soldier in the entire Skyfall initiative at 23 years old. Their target was the flagship's primary communications array. If they could take it down, Vethkaren would lose the ability to coordinate his fleet. Each ship would be fighting alone, without information about what was happening to the others. The flagship was the most heavily defended ship in the fleet. The corridors were wider. The Velthari soldiers were more experienced. The security systems were more sophisticated. Getting to the communications array was not going to be easy. Yara had not expected easy. She had expected exactly what she found. A ship full of highly trained soldiers who were confused, alarmed, and increasingly desperate. Confusion was her ally. Alarm was her ally. Desperation made enemies make mistakes. She moved through the ship using the layout that the Skyfall analysts had reconstructed from decades of intercepted Velthari communications and sensor data. The layout was not perfect. There were sections that were different from what the analysts had predicted. But it was close enough. Marcus Webb Jr. was the kind of soldier who made other soldiers feel safer just by being near him. He was large for a human, 6'4", 240 pounds of muscle and training. But his real value was not his size. It was his calm. In situations that would have broken most people, Marcus was steady. He processed information fast. He made decisions fast. He did not freeze. Aiko Tanaka was the opposite in almost every way. Small. Quick. Quiet. She had a gift for finding paths through spaces that seemed impassable. She had grown up in a city where space was always at a premium, where you learned to navigate tight spaces and find routes that other people missed. That skill, translated into a military context, made her extraordinarily effective in the close-quarters environment of a ship's interior. Together, the 3 of them moved through the flagship like water finding cracks in stone. They encountered resistance 4 times on the way to the communications array. Each time, they dealt with it quickly and moved on. They did not stop to secure prisoners. They did not stop to assess casualties. They moved. Always forward. Always toward the target. The Velthari soldiers they encountered were good fighters. Disciplined. Trained. Physically formidable. But they were fighting in a way they had never trained for. Reacting to threats that appeared from unexpected directions. In unexpected ways, at unexpected times. The human soldiers were not following any pattern that the Velthari could predict. And in combat, unpredictability is one of the most powerful weapons there is. Veth-Karen was trying to manage the crisis from his bridge. He had pulled his best soldiers back to defend the critical systems. He had ordered the ships that were still fully operational to begin targeting the pods that were still in transit. He was trying to establish some kind of order in the chaos, but the chaos was spreading faster than he could contain it. 14 ships had already gone dark. Not destroyed, the humans were not trying to destroy the ships. They were disabling them. Systematically. Precisely. Taking out the weapons first, then the engines, then the communications. Leaving the ships intact but helpless. It was a level of tactical sophistication that Veth-Karen had not expected from a species that his analysts had described as primitive. He was beginning to understand that his analysts had been very, very wrong. The report had mentioned human persistence. It had called it a curiosity. Veth-Karen was now seeing what that persistence looked like in practice. His soldiers were fighting humans who had been hit, who were injured, who were operating in an alien environment with no backup and no retreat option, and they were still moving forward. Still hitting their targets. Still completing their missions. One of his officers brought him a report from a ship in the outer screen. A single human soldier had entered the ship through the weapons bay, disabled the primary weapons system, fought through 6 Velthari soldiers to reach the engine room, disabled the main drive, and was now, according to the last report, moving toward the bridge. 1 human, against a crew of 400. Veth-Karen read the report twice. Then, he did something he had not done in 40 years of military service. He asked for advice. He called his senior tactical officer, a veteran named Soravel, who had been in more battles than anyone else on the ship, and he asked her a simple question. How do you stop them? Soravel was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Veth-Karen would remember for the rest of his life. She said, I don't think you can stop them, Commander. I think you can only slow them down. Veth-Karen stared at her. She continued, They are not fighting to win a battle. They are fighting because they cannot stop fighting. It is not strategy. It is not tactics. It is something else. Something I have never seen before. She paused. I think it is what they call will. On the flagship's communications deck, 3 levels below the bridge, Yara Osei placed the last charge on the primary communications array, looked at Marcus and Aiko, and nodded. Marcus pressed the detonator. The array went dark, and Veth-Karen's fleet went blind. When the communications array went down, something changed in the battle. Not just tactically, something deeper. Something that moved through the Velthari fleet like a cold wind through an open door. The ships that had been fighting back, the ones that still had operational weapons, the ones that still had crews trying to repel the human soldiers, began to slow down. Not because they had been defeated, not because they had run out of soldiers or weapons or options. They slowed down because they were afraid. Fear is a strange thing in a military context. Velthari military doctrine had extensive protocols for managing fear. They had studied it. They had trained against it. They had developed techniques for keeping soldiers functional even when the situation was bad. Fear was something to be managed, controlled, suppressed. But this was different. This was not the fear of losing a battle. This was something older, something more fundamental. This was the fear that comes when you realize that the thing you are fighting does not follow the rules you understand. When you realize that your enemy is operating on a completely different level of commitment than anything you have encountered before. The Velthari soldiers were brave. Nobody who had served in the Velthari military for any length of time could be called a coward. They had fought in dozens of wars. They had faced enemies that were bigger, stronger, better armed. They had held their positions under bombardment that would have broken most species. But they had never fought humans before. And humans, it turned out, were something special. General Sarah Chen watched the battle from Facility Omega with the focused attention of someone who had been planning this moment for 22 years. Her screens showed the status of every pod, every soldier, every ship. The picture was not perfect. Some soldiers had gone silent, their signals lost, their fates unknown. But the overall picture was clear. The Skyfall initiative was working. 41 Velthari ships had been disabled. 17 more were reporting critical internal breaches. The flagship had lost communications. The outer screen of the fleet, the ships that had been positioned to intercept any conventional human military response, had been hit hardest. Those ships had been the first targets, and the soldiers assigned to them had done their jobs with devastating efficiency. But Sarah was not celebrating. Not yet. Because there were still ships that had not been hit. Still ships with full weapons capability. Still ships that were now, without the coordination of the flagship's communications array, beginning to make their own decisions. And individual Velthari captains, freed from the command structure, were unpredictable. Some of them were retreating, pulling their ships back, trying to get clear of the engagement zone, trying to figure out what was happening before committing to any action. Some of them were doing something more dangerous. They were targeting Earth. 3 Velthari destroyers had broken from the fleet formation and were accelerating toward the inner solar system. Their weapons were charging. Their targeting systems were locking onto population centers. They were not trying to win the battle anymore. They were trying to punish humanity for what had happened to their fleet. Sarah had planned for this. She activated the orbital defense network, the weapons platforms that had been hiding throughout the solar system for decades, disguised as debris, as inactive satellites, as natural objects, came online simultaneously. The Velthari destroyers had been sailing past them for hours, without knowing they were there. Now, suddenly, they were surrounded. The 3 destroyers had approximately 8 seconds to realize what was happening before the orbital defense network opened fire. It was not enough time. The 3 destroyers were disabled in under a minute, not destroyed. Sarah had given explicit orders that the goal was to disable, not to kill, wherever possible. Humanity was not fighting this battle to destroy the Velthari. Humanity was fighting this battle to prove a point, to demonstrate something, to send a message that would echo through the galaxy for generations. The message was simple. We are not what you thought we were. Back on the flagship, Veth Karen was receiving reports from the ships that still had communications capability. The picture they painted was devastating. More than 60 ships disabled. The orbital defense network active and effective. The 3 destroyers that had broken toward Earth neutralized. His fleet, the fleet that had been sent to pacify a primitive civilization, was falling apart. He had one option left. He could fight. He still had ships. He still had soldiers. He could order a full assault on Earth, throw everything he had at the planet, try to overwhelm the defense network through sheer force. It would cost him enormously. He might lose the entire fleet, but he might succeed. Or he could do something that no Velthari commander had done in 6,000 years of military history. He could ask for terms. Veth Karen sat in his command chair for a long time. His bridge was quiet. His officers were watching him. Waiting. The sounds of the battle, the alarms, the damage reports, the communications from ships in distress, had faded to a low background noise. The flagship itself was still intact. The human soldiers who had entered the ship had achieved their objectives and gone quiet. They were still aboard, somewhere in the ship's lower sections, but they were not advancing. They were waiting. Waiting for him to make a decision. Veth Karen thought about the report his analysts had written 200 years ago. He thought about the word they had used. Persistence. He thought about what Soravel had said. Will. He thought about the human soldier, who had entered this ship alone, and fought through 6 of his people to reach the engine room. He thought about 12,000 soldiers falling from the sky into the middle of a fleet that should have been impossible to fight. He thought about what kind of species does that. What kind of species trains for 30 years for a battle that might never come? What kind of species volunteers to be fired at an enemy fleet in a metal pod, alone with no guarantee of survival? What kind of species, when faced with an enemy 6,000 years more advanced, does not surrender, does not panic, does not beg for mercy, but instead falls from the sky and fights. He knew the answer. The kind of species you do not want as an enemy. He opened a communications channel on the emergency frequency, the only frequency that was still working after the array had gone down. He composed a message in the Velthari language. Short, direct. The hardest words he had ever spoken in his career. He requested terms of engagement, and on the other end of the channel, General Sarah Chen read the message, closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and then opened them and began to compose her response. The ceasefire lasted 72 hours. During those 72 hours, the solar system held its breath. The Velthari ships that were still operational held their positions. The human soldiers aboard the disabled ships held their positions. Nobody fired. Nobody advanced. The battle had stopped, but the tension had not. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The negotiations took place in space. Neutral ground. A point in the asteroid belt equidistant between the Velthari flagship and Facility Omega. A small shuttle from each side. A small team from each side. No weapons. No armor. Just people sitting across a table from each other in the cold silence of space, trying to figure out what came next. General Sarah Chen led the human delegation. Veth Karen led the Velthari delegation. They sat across from each other for a long moment before anyone spoke. Sarah studied the Velthari commander. He was older than she had expected. Tired-looking. There was something in his eyes that she recognized. The look of someone who had just had their entire understanding of the world turned upside down, and was still processing it. She had seen that look before. She had seen it in the eyes of young soldiers after their first real battle. The look that said, "I thought I understood how this worked. I was wrong." Veth Karen spoke first. He said, "I have been a military commander for 40 years. I have fought in 11 campaigns. I have never asked for terms before today." Sarah said nothing. She waited. He continued, "I need to understand something. Not for the negotiation, for myself. How long have you been preparing for this?" Sarah considered the question. Then she said, "Longer than you have been watching us." Veth Karen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The report said you were not a threat." "The report was wrong," Sarah said. "Yes," he said. "It was." The negotiations that followed were long and complicated. There were moments when they nearly broke down. There were moments when the weight of what had happened, the lives lost on both sides, the ships destroyed, the soldiers who had not come home threatened to overwhelm the process. There were moments when the cultural and linguistic gaps between the two species made communication almost impossible. But they kept going. Because both sides understood something important. This battle had changed things, not just between humanity and the Velthari, between humanity and the entire galaxy. Word of what had happened in the solar system would spread. It was already spreading. The Velthari fleet had been in communication with the homeworld before the array went down. The homeworld knew that something had gone wrong. Other civilizations with their own listening posts and sensor networks had detected the battle. The galaxy was watching. And the galaxy was going to have to update its understanding of humanity. The final terms of the engagement were not a surrender. Not from either side. They were something more unusual, something that had not happened in Velthari history before. They were an acknowledgement, a formal recognition, signed by both commanders, that humanity was a spacefaring civilization with the right to defend its territory. That the Velthari fleet had entered human space without authorization. That the conflict had been initiated by the Velthari, and that the human response had been defensive. It was not everything Sarah had wanted. There were compromises. There were things she had pushed for that Veth Karen could not agree to. There were things he had pushed for that she had refused. That was negotiation. That was how it worked. But the core of it, the acknowledgement that humanity was not a primitive species to be pacified, not a problem to be managed, not a civilization that could be brought under control without consequence. That was everything. That was what the Skyfall Initiative had been built for. When Sarah returned to Facility Omega, she found her soldiers waiting for her. Not just the ones who had been in the battle, all of them. The ones who had been in the pods. The ones who had fought inside the Velthari ships. The ones who had operated the orbital defense network. The ones who had stayed at their stations in Facility Omega and managed the battle from a distance. All 12,000 of them, or as many as could fit in the facility's main bay, with the rest watching on screens throughout the asteroid. She stood in front of them and she did not give a speech. She was not a speech kind of person. She just looked at them for a long moment. At their faces, at the exhaustion and the relief and the grief and the pride all mixed together in the way that only soldiers who have been through something real can look. She thought about the ones who had not come back, the pods that had gone silent, the signals that had stopped, the names that would be added to the memorial wall in the facility's entrance corridor. She thought about Marcus Webb Sr., who had started all of this, who had spent his career being told he was paranoid, being told that the threat he was preparing for would never come, being told that the Skyfall Initiative was a waste of resources and talent and time. She wished he could have seen this. Then she said 2 words, "Well done." And 12,000 soldiers, the most extraordinary human beings who had ever lived, the people who had fallen from the sky and changed everything, responded with a sound that shook the walls of the asteroid. The galaxy heard about the battle of the solar system within weeks. The Velthari homeworld received the full report. Other civilizations received fragments, intercepted communications, sensor data, the accounts of Velthari soldiers who had been aboard the disabled ships. The story spread in the way that important stories always spread. Imperfectly. With gaps and distortions and embellishments, but the core of it remained intact. Humanity had been attacked by one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. And humanity had won. Not because humans were the strongest, not because humans were the fastest or the most technologically advanced, but because humans had done something that no other species had thought to do. They had prepared. They had trained. They had refused to accept that the outcome was inevitable. They had looked at an enemy 6,000 years more advanced and said, "We can find a way." And then they had fallen from the sky. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed. Other civilizations that had been considering humanity as a potential target quietly reconsidered. Trade negotiations that had been stalled for decades suddenly moved forward. Diplomatic channels that had been closed opened. The galaxy, it turned out, had a great deal of respect for a species that could do what humanity had done. Vethkaren retired from the Velthari military 6 months after the battle. In his retirement speech, he said something that was widely reported across the galaxy. He said that in 40 years of military service, he had learned one lesson that he wished he had learned earlier. He said, "Never write off a species that refuses to be written off." On Earth, the Skyfall Initiative was declassified. The soldiers were given their names back. Their stories were told. The world learned what had been happening in secret for a century. The reaction was complicated. There was pride, and there was shock, and there was debate about the secrecy and the cost and the choices that had been made. That was normal. That was human. But underneath all of it, there was something else. Something that every person on Earth felt when they looked up at the sky and thought about what had happened up there. About 12,000 soldiers falling through space in metal pods toward an enemy fleet. About the moment those pods hit the hulls of alien warships and the doors blew open and human beings stepped out into the unknown. That feeling did not have a simple name. But it felt something like pride. It felt something like recognition. It felt like the galaxy had finally seen what humans really were. And the galaxy would not forget. Here's the thing that nobody talks about. After the negotiations were over, after the Velthari fleet had withdrawn, after the ceasefire had held, and the terms had been signed, and the immediate crisis had passed, Vethkaren sent one final private message to General Sarah Chen. It was not an official communication. It was not part of the negotiation record. It was a personal message, sent on a private channel, from one military commander to another. It said, "I have reviewed the original report on your species. The report that said you were not a threat. I have been trying to understand how we got it so wrong. and I think I finally understand. We were measuring you against what we expected a threat to look like. We were looking for the things that had made other species dangerous: size, technology, age, resources. You had none of those things. Not in the quantities that we considered significant. So we dismissed you. But we were measuring the wrong things. The thing that makes your species dangerous is not something that shows up on a sensor scan. It is not something that appears in a technology assessment. It is something that you carry inside you. Something that does not diminish when the odds are against you. Something that, if anything, gets stronger when the situation is most desperate. I do not have a word for it in my language, but I think you know what I mean. Sarah Chen read that message 3 times. Then she saved it. She printed it. She framed it, and she hung it on the wall of her office in Facility Omega, next to the memorial for the soldiers who had not come home. Because Veth Karen was right. She did know what he meant. The thing he was describing was not a military capability. It was not a technology or a strategy or a tactic. It was something older than all of those things. Something that had been in humanity since the beginning. Since the first human being looked at a world that was trying to kill them and decided to keep going anyway. It was the thing that made humans human. And the galaxy had finally seen it. If this story opened your eyes to what humanity is truly capable of, what we carry inside us that no enemy can calculate and no report can capture, then you already understand why this story matters. Let us take a moment to look at what just happened in this story. Humanity was written off, dismissed, labeled as primitive, weak, and not worth taking seriously. And then, when the moment came, humanity did not just survive. Humanity won. Not through luck, not through superior technology. Through preparation, through courage, through the kind of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that is uniquely, powerfully human. The Skyfall Initiative was not built in a day. It was built over a century. By people who believed in something that most of the world could not see yet. By soldiers who trained for a battle that might never come. By a general who spent 22 years preparing for 60 seconds of falling through space. That is the first takeaway. Preparation is not paranoia. Preparation is respect. Respect for the future. Respect for the stakes. Respect for the people who are counting on you to be ready. The second takeaway is about what the Velthari got wrong. They measured humanity against the wrong standards. They looked for the things they already knew how to measure. They missed the thing that actually mattered. That is a lesson that goes far beyond science fiction. In life, in business, in relationships, in every arena where people compete and struggle and try to achieve something, the most dangerous thing you can do is assume you know what your opponent is capable of. Assume you know what a person is made of. Assume you know what a species can do. You might be very, very wrong. The third takeaway is the one that Veth Karen put into words in that final message. The thing that makes humans dangerous is not something that shows up on a sensor scan. It is something we carry inside us. Something that gets stronger when things get harder. Something that the galaxy had never seen before and will never forget. That thing is you. It is all of us. It is what we are. Now here is what I want you to do. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if it made you feel something real, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that this story is worth sharing. And this story deserves to be shared. Subscribe to Hey-Fi Sci-Fi for more stories like this one. Stories about humanity. Stories about what we are capable of when we are pushed to the edge. Stories that remind you why being human is not a limitation. It is a superpower. Leave a comment below with one word. Just one word that describes how this story made you feel. I read every single comment. I want to know what this story meant to you. And if you want to go deeper, if you want more Hey-Fi stories that will give you chills and make you proud to be human, the next video is already waiting for you. It is about another moment when humanity surprised the galaxy. Another moment when the universe learned not to underestimate us. Click it now. You will not regret it. One last question before you go. If you had been one of those 12,000 soldiers, if you had been sitting in that pod, falling through space toward an alien warship, knowing what was waiting on the other side of that door. What would you have been thinking in those final seconds? Tell me in the comments. Because I think your answer says everything about what kind of human you are. And I think it would have been exactly the right answer.